This is Dr. Jyoti Jennewein. She was my colleague at the University of Idaho when we worked on our PhDs together, and presently she is a research associate for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Maryland. She specializes in remote sensing of landscapes, including Arctic systems and post-fire environments. Her passions lie in the integration of remote sensing platforms to answer questions related to global climate change. Today, she is going to join us to teach about moose behavioral adaptations in Alaska. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Jyoti.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you, Megan, for that kind introduction. So as you can see, I'm just going to walk through a little bit of background about myself. So back in 2007, ancient history, I graduated with my bachelor's in health and exercise science. I originally thought I would go into physical therapy, and since then I've really discovered my love of natural resources and remote sensing. So that was a bit of a circuitous path, and since then I did my Peace Corps service in West Africa and Niger. I did all sorts of seasonal work, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I attended Moss in 2012 and 2013, which started my path in graduate school. I did a National Science Foundation GK-12 Communication Fellowship in Lewiston, Idaho for a year. And I completed my master's from the Natural Resources College at U of I in 2015. I met Megan, Dr. Ford, in the Confluence Project the year after that. During my PhD, I worked as a hydrologic research technician at the Rocky Mountain Research Station at the Forest Service in Moscow. And then I completed my PhD in 2020 through the U of I as well in natural resources. So I am currently a research physical scientist as a postdoctoral researcher with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. So my focus throughout my PhD has been in remote sensing. So remote sensing is awesome. And before I get into that, I just want to introduce this little gray box here, which Dr. Ford will drag my video into so you can see me as I talk about my slides. So that's what this little gray box is in the upper right corner of all of my slides. So remote sensing is a really awesome set of sciences. It's often a methodology-based science. So you are observing Earth or distant planets, depending on how specialized you get, using remote technology. So anytime you use a camera on your phone, anytime you take a video, anytime you use the satellite, this is remote sensing, interacting or studying something when you're not touching it directly. We often take physical samples in remote sensing to tie back to our remote measures. So my specialty has been in plants and for the last 5 or 6 years. So I have done remote sensing in Alaska, which is a part of what this presentation today is about, specified with animal behavior of moose. But I did a whole set of studies about forage quality that tie to different remotely sensed metrics, basically. So that can be a camera mounted on a pole, as you can see here in this far right photo. This is a photo from what I'm currently doing. And then this photo on the bottom left is something that I've been working on in Alaska, where I was remote sensing forage quality. So there's a lot of different scales of this, but ultimately remote sensing rocks. If you're interested in it, it's a great career path, and it's also really, really fun. So I'd like to go ahead and dive into what Dr. Ford invited me to talk about today. So I'd like to just start off with a broad background on what this NASA project was I was working on in my PhD. So NASA's Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, or ABOVE, is a wonderful set of experiments that basically studies warming-induced ecosystem changes in North American Arctic boreal regions. So you can see the red outline here in this graphic is the dominant study area, and the purple is the extended study area. So all of our research for this project has been occurring in this domain. And you can see in this bottom right corner here, the Animals in the Move project was the project I was funded under for my dissertation at U of I. So we were looking at GPS telemetry locations from animals all across this landscape. And I worked specifically with moose, which is what I'll talk about today, but many of our colleagues worked with all these other animals you see on this graphic here. So we looked at bear behavior, wolf denning. Moose was one of my specialties, golden eagle juvenile displacement, or disbursement, excuse me, caribou migration, and robins, which is the smaller line here. So we are the first study to be able to tag robins with small enough GPS tags. So it was a really wide ranging project with a lot of expertise. And I kind of zoomed in on one specific animal in moose with the help of the National Park Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So under this big above designation, we were specifically wondering how flora and fauna are responding to environmental change in this area, which is undergoing 2 to 3 times the rate of global warming that we're seeing in this area. So it's changing rapidly, and so therefore habitats are changing. And so we've been trying to assess how animals are changing behavior as a result of this. So I'd like to show you a fun video. So our data from this project were housed in a server online called MoveBank. And so Sarah Davidson, who you can see credited here, who's the curator of this resource, made this video. So these are different GPS telemetry locations that are being tagged across moving animals across the year 2010. There's a timestamp in that upper right-hand corner. So this is showing mostly bird migrations across the US, Russia, Africa that are going north. As the season progresses, it gets green. And then as we start to see the snow come again, the whiteness will appear in that upper part from satellite imagery, and we'll see the migration occurring southward. So this is the power of what a combination of remote sensing imagery from satellites can do, as well as this GPS telemetry from various collared animals. And obviously, this is just a nice graphic to show the power of these two tools combined, but really to do the science well, you zoom in on a specific species, usually in a specific area, which is what I'll talk about next. So before I get into some of the science behind movement ecology, those telemetry locations that get pinged to satellites, I'd like to just talk about moose in a little bit more depth. So moose, especially in these Arctic boreal regions, are ecosystem engineers. And that's a little bit of a big word, but what that means is that these are organisms that moderate the availability of a resource to other species. So this is something that could be well represented by something like beavers as well. So beavers change their habitat enough that they can dam up a river, for instance, and create a whole pond where fish could live. So ecosystem engineers are causing physical state changes to an ecosystem, and moose and other boreal herbivores like hares are an example of that in this system. So for moose, there are 2 main ways that they act as ecosystem engineers. The first of which is modifying the quality and the quantity of plant litter. So in this diagram, you can see I've got my 2 herbivores here in the upper left, and that by eating different shrubs, they're changing what is being dropped to the ground to decompose from these leaves. So in an unbrowsed area or an uneaten area, say in an herbivore exclosure, for instance, we see that biomass of litter, or the amount of that shedding of the leaves, is decreased by about 50%. We also see that these areas tend to stay in early successional stages like willow for longer than they would otherwise. Plants that are browsed upon by these herbivores tend to facilitate an early successional change to other species, such as alder or conifers, which can slow the carbon turnover and nutrient turnover of these systems. So basically, areas that are not highly browsed, say you have a low herbivore density or you have an exclosure, tend to have a higher quality of litter which is more easily decomposed than areas that have a higher browsing pressure from these herbivores. The second way that moose and hares are acting as ecosystem engineers is directly through their excretions. So, they're fertilizing this input. They are increasing the mineralization of nitrogen, which allows the assimilation of this nitrogen or fertilization of plants. So they're accelerating nutrient turnover as well. So there's a bit of a tug and a pull here between how much pressure there is on how well they're eating their resources, as well as what their fertilizing is. And this obviously depends on population density as well. And I'd just like to show 2 photos. This is an example of what browsing can do in these areas. So these are photos taken from a couple of my other research studies up in Alaska above the Arctic Circle. So you can see that moose really can define what's happening to a plant here in the left image, just totally bare stripped as they go to eat. And then in this right-hand photo here, this is mostly hair damage. So they nibble around the edges of these plants, which can basically kill them, which is why you have these like cyclical hare population densities that happen, is that they will harm themselves by eating too much of their resources and not have enough to sustain their population. So there's a lot of tug and pull here between what's available to an animal and what they're ultimately able to access. So my study specifically was focusing on temperatures and the role of temperatures on moose. And so I'd like to just briefly go to a little bit of background on what thermoregulation is before I get into the paper. So there are several ways that mammals or endotherms can exchange heat with their environment. So first we have direct solar radiation. So the sun is shining on you, you're getting warm. We also have diffuse solar radiation, which can transmit through clouds or bounce off of clouds. There's also a thermal conduction that can happen. Say you were laying on the ground or an animal's laying on the ground and you're directly exchanging heat through that medium. And then there's also convection, which can come through wind or water or other flowing substances. A little bit of background on some of this. So as temperature increases, so you have a low temperature here in the bottom left, increasing to a higher temperature here on the right, you could expect that as temperatures warm, that a body temperature will increase in a mammal. What's also happening is that evaporative heat loss is occurring. So as temperatures warm, you start to see an increase here in that. So some strategies for evaporative heat loss include sweating, but they can also include panting, and in animals especially that are not sweating. You can also see that metabolic rate changes. So this is the amount of energy that an animal is spending to maintain a given set of temperatures. So in this case, you can see that typically at the lower end of what's survivable, there's a lot of energy spent to stay warm enough. But also as you start to get too warm, energy is spent to conduct this evaporative heat loss, especially in the context of panting. So those are the three main contexts here for thermoregulation in mammals. So this is the definition of the survival zone here. So in this zone, lives are at risk. So whether you're too cold or you're too hot, an animal is fighting for their lives at the extreme end of this diagram. What's usually happening and what animals try to strive for is this thermal neutral zone here, which is a much smaller range and will vary by species. So this is the range that an animal tries to maintain that minimizes the amount of calories they're spending to stay within this range. So you're not spending much energy staying cold, and you're not spending much energy to stay warm in a cold environment, and you're not spending too much energy here to stay cool in a warm environment. And for moose, this is actually a very small range. So moose are these big bodied creatures that are designed for cold environments. And so their upper critical threshold here for their thermal neutral zone is only 14 degrees Celsius. And so they become heat stressed at quite low temperatures. And this is where the study that I did comes in. So a lot of work has been done in the lower 48, especially around like Maine and Minnesota, that says moose are at risk of heat stress at temperatures we thought weren't possible, especially as climate change progresses. But no studies had been done up in the northern portion of their range, such as Alaska. So the purpose of my study was to investigate how Alaska moose change their behavior as a function of temperature. And to do this, we used GPS collars and remote sensing layers. And we, as I mentioned, previous studies had occurred in the southern range of moose in North America or in Europe. And so this was kind of a novel study in that we were looking at an area that hadn't been looked at before. And our literature tells us that moose, when it gets hot, will do a few different things behaviorally to try not to spend calories, as we were just showing throughout that different range of evaporative heat loss or metabolic expenditures. So as you might expect, when it's hot, they try to reduce activity, not do anything, right? So they're not spending calories. They're also trying to go into the shaded areas, so minimize exposure to shaded radiation, to solar radiation. And they're also selecting for taller and denser forest canopies. In addition, they seek out resources such as water or riparian areas to cool via that convective radiation that was mentioned earlier. So those are some of the strategies that that science has found in the past. And so those were some of the foundational pieces that we looked at in our study. This is a map that you may have seen in the paper This is the 4 different study regions in Alaska that we were looking at. And so we have 4 different populations that are kind of spread around the state. And these were all provided to us through our colleagues at the National Park Service, as well as the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. This northern population, the yellow, that's the Park Services, and it's a collaboration between them and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, but that's where Gates of the Arctic National Park is, which is all above the Arctic Circle. So we looked at summer data, so when you're most likely to see a thermal response and behavior to moose over 8 years, which was when all these moose were collared. And ultimately, we were looking at about 170 moose over this time period. And I thought it would be interesting to just show a couple photos. So I've spent the most time up in that northern portion. That's where my other couple chapters from my dissertation occurred, looking more at the remote sensing of vegetation. It's definitely beautiful. The Brooks Range is a rugged and lovely area. It's also very harsh, early winters, very vulnerable to climate change. When I was there a couple of years ago, it was 90 degrees and it felt like it was 100 degrees or more. It just felt so weird to be above the Arctic Circle and be so hot. This area here, the blue region, the Susitna, this was just south of the Alaska Range. So this big white circle here, that's Denali, which is the highest peak in North America. The other 2 regions, Tanana here in green and Innoku here in purple, those are much flatter regions, as you can see from this digital elevation model in the background of Alaska here. So kind of 2 more plains types of moose and 2 more mountainous species of moose. Well, they're all the same species, but populations. So our hypothesis for this was that Alaska moose exhibit a detectable behavioral response to temperature, as we've seen in the previous literature. And perhaps obviously we were hypothesizing and predicting then that they would select for cooler locations as temperature increased. But we specifically were wondering whether they would select for riparian areas that could convectively cool from water, or whether they would select for areas that had low exposure to solar radiation and denser canopy covers. And to go through this, we use something called a resource selection model. And resource selection models are something that can occur at several different physical space levels, so different spatial resolutions. And so resource selection functions are a way to statistically model habitat use as a function of the area available to them, and that they vary by scale, as I mentioned. And so there are 4 orders of selection. This diagram from a paper that one of my committee members co-authored kind of shows 3 of them. So first order selection is usually the population range. So in this case, this is a specific population of caribou in Canada. They occupy this specific place in BC. And then the second order selection is the population home range. So you're within this particular area and this population occupies this part of the area. And then each individual caribou in this example has a home range. So where they would usually frequent to eat, where they would frequent to run from predators, where they would breed, etc. And then what's not shown in this diagram is that fourth order selection is the procurement of specific resources. So something within a home range, such as a specific patch of food. And so we typically try to choose one scale to operate in when we're doing these resource selection functions. And the way that this works is that you have an animal, such as the moose, and it has a GPS collar on which pings to a satellite. And over space and time, you start to see these X's, which is where the moose was. And that pings up to the satellite, and it gives us a specific set of coordinates and a specific time that those animals were in that location. And there are obviously lots of characteristics that influence when an animal was where and when. So a lot of the time herbivores are using this willow or other forage species, but can also be influenced by predators or landscape features as well. And what we do mathematically, statistically, is we take these X's where an animal was located and we compare them to where an animal was not at that point in time. So our GPS collars are not fine enough to say they never went to that location, but that they weren't at that location at the specific point in time. So you take a series of X's and you generate a series of O's to compare them to. And that'll again depend on which spatial scale you're working at. This paper specifically used what's called the step selection function, which is one of the finer scales. So usually operating at that third or fourth order selection scale, where you have a series of X's and you compare that to a series of O's that are within a distribution around that X. So you're taking a step length, so how far an animal typically travels and which direction they're typically traveling, and you're comparing this set of X's to this set of O's. And this is what's called a stratum. And that's a little bit of a jargony term, but ultimately this is the beauty of the step selection function. I'm not comparing every single X to every single O. I'm comparing each X to a set of O's that were generated around it. And that allows you to get at some of that more fine scale selection behavior. So what does this look like on the landscape? So again, here's this photo from the Susitna Range. So you have a satellite that will pass over this area that you're timing with your GPS collections. So this is an example of what that scene might look like here. So you have some mountains, you have a river, and here's where your GPS collar is saying your moose looks at down here. But the algorithm that you run says, oh, well, your moose could have been over here. So you run a comparison between what's here versus what's there. Another example is a moose typically in the valley bottom, but you might have an available location appear up here on top of a mountain. And that's the sort of contrasts that get made in a statistical framework. So again, we were specifically looking at moose resource selection as a function of temperature. So we were looking at riparian habitat, so areas that were wet. We were looking at denser canopied forests, and we were looking at solar radiation. And so what we found was that moose, both males and females, tended to select for areas of denser canopy cover as temperature increased. So each panel in this example is a different population. So we have the upper Koyukuk population, the Susitna, which is in that Alaska Range area, the Anoku and the Tananaws, which were those flatter terrains. And in all cases, you can see at the highest temperatures, which are these red lines, versus the lowest temperatures, the blue lines, we see that the red line is above the blue line. This y-axis is the probability of selection. So what this is saying is that these populations, and here's the males, are more likely to be selecting for areas of denser canopy compared at higher temperatures compared to lower temperatures. So again, here's the females. We have percent canopy cover here on the x-axis, so 0 up to 100, right? Because you can only have 100% canopy cover or 0% canopy cover in between. Can't have negative values. And as higher temperatures occurred, moose were more likely to select for an area of denser canopy cover. And one thing to note here is that in the more mountainous populations, which are the top two panels here, as well as in the boys, we see that the spread is bigger than compared to the lower areas. So we're seeing that in the flatter areas, this selection difference is lower. So that's an interesting finding of this paper. So in summary, we found that moose in Alaska are using this common behavioral strategy to mitigate heat stress by selecting for areas that have a denser canopy cover. We also see that this varied by population and by sex. And so females tended to demonstrate a stronger selection response in 2 out of the 3 populations, and that the most northern and the most southern, more mountainous regions had a stronger selection response. So this study used millions of data points, as you can imagine, from 2008 to 2016 in 4 populations in Alaska, 4 fixes a day. And so there was at one point over a Thanksgiving break, maybe you recognize this GIS lab at the U of I, but I took over every single computer at Luigi's acceptance to run some of my simulations to allow me to do this work. And so I would go in and I would check on the computers and try to use them at a time that perhaps not anybody else would be in the lab. So this was a study that took quite a lot of computing power. And eventually I had to actually move to some cloud computing. So some of the other questions that I thought might be interesting to address were that there are several factors that are influencing seasonal and day-to-day behavior of moose, and also as a result of climate change. So we see that there are shrub expansions happening. So this is a part of where my second and third research chapters in my dissertation came in. So shrubs are expanding at an unprecedented rate, which is good for moose generally. If they're willow or other edible species, there's more forage resources for them. However, this trade-off of warmer temperatures happening, as we can see, there's a behavioral response to temperature. So wildfires are also increasing here. So that might burn up the available cover that moose are getting from canopy here. So there's this intricate play between increased forage resources, wildfires in this area, melting snow, ice, and permafrost, and several other kind of weather characteristics and availability of habitat. So generally, there are some studies that are showing that moose are tending to trend northward. So they're already pretty far north. The Brooks Range is where they kind of are at right now. There are some that go up into the Arctic above that, the tundra, but there's not a lot of cover there for them, thermal cover. So what this is saying is that that line where they're able to go up might be able to increase. So there are several other studies that are working on trying to understand that, but other studies outside of this one are suggesting moose are also trending northward. So there's still quite a lot of work to do in this area, and I'm really grateful to have gotten to do this study, especially with the collaboration of several agencies up in Alaska. And there are several other studies that are ongoing that are building off of some of the work I've done with the forage quality piece. So what might be driving moose's migration or preference for different forage materials. But that's a different egg.